the Government Operations Committee is doing is looking at how we can contribute to some of the solutions. And what we have is this S.220. I didn't bring copies or anything, but it's looking at specific professions to require them to have continuing education in solutions for climate change and as a part of their licensure or ongoing, if they're already licensed as ongoing continuing education credits. So currently it only addresses architects, landscape architects, pollution abatement facility operators, potable water supply and wastewater system designers, professional engineers, property inspectors, real estate appraisers, and real estate brokers and salespersons. But I think there are a lot of other professions we could look at. HVAC people. We have a whole initiative down in the southern part of the state around green building called S.220 An, and they have come up with some courses and programs for builders and insulators. So there are a lot of professions that we're going to start with these. We'll be working with the Office of Professional Regulation on what it might look like, and if they have boards that regulate them, or if they're advisors. Some professions have boards, and some professions just have advisors through the Office of Professional Regulation. And so we'll be working with either their boards or the Office of Professional Regulation around what the content would look like. We're not telling them what the content should be because we clearly don't know exactly what it should be, but we'll be taking testimony on that. We're just starting it on Wednesday.
You say you can take testimony on the content or just on the idea and maybe other trades and professions?
We'll be starting the bill when.
No, the way you said it sounded like you'd be taking testimony on what the content of the.
The curriculum?
Yeah.
No, we won't be taking testimony on that. We'll be taking testimony on how we approach these professions, how we work with them, what other professions might be, or licensees might be applicable to this, how we proceed. That's what we'll be doing. I don't think government operations is in the position to be designing the curriculum. I think that has to come from someplace else.
Are you looking at purely existing licensed professions, or thinking about considering contract registration?
Well, since we can't require, if they're not licensed, we can't require that they have, there's nothing to tie it to. We can recommend that, and what SEON does down there has courses that builders and contractors take, but they're not licensed, so they're not required to take them. And just an interesting thing about it says real estate appraisers, and I think agents were in here, I'm not sure. But I went to our planning commission meeting a couple weeks ago, and I brought this up, and this woman had just come back from Italy, and she said in every single window of every house, or not in every single window, but in every house that's for sale, there's this poster, and she put a picture of it and sent it to me, but of course it was in Italian, so I have no idea what it said. But it gives the energy ratings and everything of the house itself, and she said that's common all over Europe. So those are the kinds of things that we're looking at here.
Rita and then Chris.
Yeah, will you be talking to Jen Small, they head of state colleges, especially community college of Vermont, that is trying to gear up, providing courses, the needs, that people see as they need in this context, only if they're the people that provide the continuing education for the professions that we're talking about. Some of them are the continuing education units are provided by the association itself. So we will be talking to them, and also hopefully talking maybe to career centers around how they can work through with the professionals. Chris?
Jeanette, thank you for taking a leadership role here. One of the issues that came up as we were going around the state this fall, and it relates to appraisers, is the idea that banks are potentially willing to get people into a quote unquote remortgage. So you add a little bit to your mortgage in order to install solar or in order to do weatherization. And I've been working with Chris Delia, who's the head of the Bankers Association. He says that there's nothing that he can find in the Freddie and Fannie rules that would preclude that. That what we come up against is the appraisals. And that we have not still figured out how to acknowledge the value of solar. So I hope you'll include looking into that. And Delia told me that the big banks will never testify. They do not testify in any state legislature, which is kind of amazing. But he is willing to come in and talk about it. So it's just, as I understand it, there's two, Nancy from the Realtors told me there's 2 green appraisers in the state. And clearly need this piece of curriculum. So I just hope, because that not only deals with the professionals, but it potentially opens, of course, a real amount, serious amount of money for Vermonters who want to make these investments.
And just to that point, I believe that Dan Yates, president of Renewable Savings and Loan, and some of his crew are up here today to talk climate caucus issues. So I don't know all the other bankers, but he's going to be very willing to take this on.
The point is, part of our goal is not just to celebrate bills and push bills, but to find these little roadblocks that exist and to be fixed with a sentence or two, or try to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
If anybody has any suggestions, just send them to me. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks for being with us.
Have to leave.
Okay, so now we have Collin Smythe from the Agency of Natural Resources, who is going to give us the high-level overview of the emissions, the 2016 emissions data. Some of your committees may have already seen or may in the near future see the full report, which takes about an hour, but we did want to have just the top level acknowledgement of what we see in the 2016 data from Collin. So, you know how to fire that up.
And I'm Collin Smythe from the Agency of Natural Resources, and I'm going to give a brief presentation on the 1990 to 2016 greenhouse gas emissions inventory and forecast report. So to start off with why we produce this inventory in the first place. It's required by state statute, and it helps us to kind of better understand our emissions profile, if you will, kind of where all of our different emissions are coming from and various sector contributions, and to be a participant in kind of a larger regional and global effort to combat greenhouse gas emissions. I'm going to touch on the lag time issue, which comes up a lot. So why is this current, quote unquote, current data only through 2016? And that is really because of a couple of different reasons. A lot of these estimates are based on large federal data sets, and it takes a long time for those to kind of come out and get processed. And then those data sets are then incorporated into tools that EPA creates that they then distribute to the states. And so the latest data, called SEDS data, it's the state energy data set, that is out right now is for 2017. And so that just came out this past summer, and that has not yet been incorporated into these EPA tools that I use to create this data. There are certain pieces that are certainly available, and you can kind of manually incorporate some of that, but that is, and as you'll see a little bit later in this presentation, I did try to put together kind of preliminary estimates for 2017 and 2018 emissions totals by sector. And the 2017 at least is pretty complete because I was able to incorporate that 2017 data that was released this summer. So this is kind of just an illustration that the release this year was later than usual, but in terms of kind of other states in the region. Most of them are only through 2016 currently. All I could find that was more current than 2016 was Connecticut, and that just came out about 2 weeks ago. So this release was a little bit later, but we're relatively on par with all the other states around us. I'll just very briefly kind of touched on this one. This is just an example of that state energy data systems data set, and just really talking about some of the things I already mentioned, how it's incorporated into these tools, and all this process takes time for everybody to use this data and to incorporate it. So this is kind of just it's an overall picture of our emissions by sector, and it doesn't get incredibly specific, but you get an idea of kind of the different contributions. And you will see that from 2015 to 2016, we did indeed decrease our emissions somewhat. However, we're still 13% above our 1990 baseline levels. So we still have a lot of progress to make to get anywhere near our goals. But most of that decrease from 2015 to 2016 was based on electricity sector emissions reductions and the residential commercial fuel use sector, and that is generally driven by winter temperatures and the need for heating demand. And I will also note one other kind of thing to note is that, and I'll go into this a little bit more detail than I was planning, but the 2015 number is actually higher in this report than it was in the previous report, and that is because when these new data sets, the federal data sets come out, they will update back years if they have updates available. And so they did that for 2015, and so the residential commercial fuel use sector went up slightly. So if you notice that in the report, the 2015 number is higher than it was in the last version. So this is just kind of it's a snapshot of our emissions, and it shows the changes to 2016 and relative to 1990 and relative to 2015. And so you can see in this column is how the emissions in each sector compare to 1990 values. And you'll see kind of the two big ones are the transportation sector and the residential commercial industrial fuel use sector, or the RCI sector, as I call it, to save tongue twisting a little bit. And again, this is just a snapshot. So these kind of specific pieces in here are not everything that is included in this inventory. They're just kind of the main pieces that have moved up and down in those comparisons. But so you'll see relative to 2015, transportation has stayed pretty flat. Electricity and the RCI sector have both gone down. There was a little increase in the fossil fuel industry numbers. That category really only contains natural gas transmission and distribution. That's not the actual combustion of natural gas, and so there is very little of that in Vermont. Yeah, and small decreases in waste management as well. But yeah, as I say, we're still 13% above our 1990 baseline levels. And the graphic over here, I apologize, it's a little hard to see, but it just gives you an idea of kind of the different percent contributions by sector. And so you'll notice that transportation and residential, commercial, industrial fuels are by far our largest contributing sectors. So this is a slide, and again, I'm sorry, it's hard to see, but there's a lot of information I was trying to get on this, and in the report, it's a little easier to see. These are the emissions estimates, the preliminary estimates for 2017 and 2018. And you can see in the 2017 values, I've color coded some of these. So for the red color coding, that just means that I carried the data forward. I didn't have a better data set, and I thought it was reasonable to just move that number from 2016 to 2017. And the blue ones are where I have kind of changed. I've used a different methodology than what we normally do to get at that value. And so that's kind of why these are preliminary, because we are sure to maintain our consistency through the years, so everything is very comparable. You'll notice 2017 is pretty good. The only red ones I think are this coal use, which has been 0 for a long time, and limestone and dolomite use. And the main reason the 2017 hasn't really been totally finalized yet is that for the transportation sector, we use values that come out of the National Emissions Inventory, which is, EPA is currently working on that right now. And the reason we choose to do that is because we put together, I spend a lot of time putting together very specific vehicle fleet information and like age distributions and various classifications data by county. And then we send it to EPA. They run this very sophisticated motor vehicle emissions simulation model and put the emissions in the National Emissions Inventory. And so we feel that's a pretty robust number and probably more accurate than we could get just by using vehicle miles traveled or fuel use data. So this will be my last slide, and then I can take some questions. And I have more if there are specific questions, I can go into those too. But this is just kind of a snapshot in terms of our historical emissions. And these are the goals, the targets that we have to go forward, including both statute goals and the comprehensive energy plan goals. And as you see, there's a long way to go.
Questions?
We'll be sure that you can send us that, right? That slide deck, so we'll distribute that to the caucus so you can bore into the numbers if you want.
Questions, committee?
I have a question. Do you feel like you have, this is your job, right? Or is there a team of people working on it? It's your job. Is that? Yeah, right, one of your jobs. So I guess that's my question is do we need to, is that the appropriate level? Maybe it's an impossible question for you to ask, but other states that are also doing this kind of metrics, is it part of one person's job in New York or Massachusetts, or are there teams? Trying to get a sense of, if we have really dedicated the resources we need to this challenge.
Sure. I'm going to be honest. I don't know exactly how many people all those other states have. My impression is that it is definitely more than one person. And I have interacted with some people from other states, but I haven't asked them. They're the only one working on it generally. So I would say yes. I would say that having more people involved in this would be beneficial. It is a lot of work to put all this data together and try to make sure it all makes sense and make sure it's accurate.
Back to you, Collin. Good to see you. My question is in regards to carbon sequestration, and I presume you have been working with Forest and Recreation, perhaps to track carbon sequestration with our forests, Have you noticed any trends, in particular, the potential for reasons why that there may be trending in the wrong direction?
Sure, I will do my best to answer that. Yes, I do not speak to Forest, Parks and Recreation for this inventory. I have formerly been working with Sandy Wilmot there, who retired, and so she kind of helped us to set up our methodology for that. And actually, in this inventory report, we got that information directly from Forest Inventory Analysis Group, which is of USDA, I guess. So it's a national data set, but it is what they put into kind of the EPA major greenhouse gas report called the Sources and Sinks report. And so people at FIA have actually extracted that data set for Vermont in terms of sequestration values.
And what's the basis of those? Do they actually work with our state to determine that, or are
I
they using
guess-
remote sensing?
Yes, I believe they do. I honestly am not an expert on how they come up with those values, but and I think it's actually changed in recent years, my understanding, but they do use some remote sensing, but also field plots. And so, yes, I believe they work closely with.
And one follow-up is, and so there's no one sounds like no one specifically took Sandy Wilmot's place to help maintain the inventory for carbon sequestration?
I honestly don't know the answer to that. Not that I'm aware of, but I'm not in that.
And one follow-up on agriculture, we know that healthy soils also sequester carbon. Is there any work or inventory going on with respect to that?
Not at the moment in terms of sequestration, but that soil carbon is certainly a component of this inventory in the agricultural sector. So it is included, but I have not tried to incorporate the sequestration from ag soils into it. And I may be able to expand a little bit on your forest sequestration question. So the data shows that we received from FIA that we do look at some data from Vermont to kind of check it. And the reason we kind of started that process was because in previous years, the data that we would receive for sequestration was very all over the place, to the point where Vermont would be a net emitter and then a net sequesterer 1 year to the next. And so if you subtracted the sequestration from our total emissions, it would be positive and then negative, and which obviously wasn't right. And so we kind of just didn't want to include that. And so we had previously used kind of a surrogate total forested land and above ground biomass. And tracking those, the total forested land number has been going down slightly over time. And so the sequestration is kind of tracking that value. And so it hasn't been going down extremely quickly at all, but that's why that sequestration value has been gradually.
So we didn't give you a whole lot of time to do your presentation, but I do need to ask for a little bit more information. Your projections out into the future show a sort of optimistic, one might say rosy picture of where we are going to be.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering what you're basing that on. Are there new state or federal programs, policies coming online that you factored into to say that we would
Sure.
see that kind of reduction?
Very fair question. I'm assuming you're talking about the 2021 and 2026?
Yes.
Okay. No, and I tried to make pretty clear in the report that I did my best to put those together, but that those are really at best directional, because there are just so many factors, a couple of which you just mentioned, that can influence those values. And so what I did, a lot of those I just carried forward because I had no real way that I felt was credible to even get at that number for certain sectors. For some of the other ones, the big ones, which I think is what's driving the reductions that you're talking about, I just used the annual energy outlook, which is it's a projection that is provided by the EIA, the Energy Information Administration. And so they incorporate a whole lot of those factors, more than I can even read about. But that was the best I was able to do, but with the very large caveat that I put no stock in those actual values, because there are so many policy factors and oil and gas price factors, and so many things can have very dramatic kind of influences on those numbers.
When do you think you'll have 2017 numbers?
As I kind of showed, they are almost entirely done. And in the 2017 and 2018 preliminary numbers, most of them are black coded, which means that I actually did the standard inventory methodology to come up with those values. And so I don't know the percentage off the top of my head, but it's probably, for 2017, it's probably at least 90%. And so it will certainly be in 2017. We're really waiting on the national emissions inventory to come out. And that's in 2020 at some point. It's supposed to be, I believe, summer 2020, but it's kind of notoriously unsure about when the actual release date on that is. So we're really just want to get that value to kind of true up ours, because it's an every 3-year inventory that EPA puts out. And so we like to have that in there to true up our numbers to make sure that they make sense, how we're estimating them. So I would say, yeah, it's definitely going to be in 2020. It may be late summer, fall would be my hope, but I kind of have to see how it all goes.
Mike, and then Molly?
Yeah, so your chart's only taking into account fossil fuel combustion, right? Emissions from fossil fuels.
For the whole inventory?
Yeah.
No.
Does it include biomass?
No. It does not include biomass because the standard inventory convention right now is to consider biomass carbon neutral, which I may have differing opinions about, but that's the convention that is currently used. And so at the end, and I apologize, I didn't get into it here, at the end of the actual report, there is a section that kind of gives different scenarios, and that's kind of also the convention, is to track those pieces separately, so you have them. So I have calculated biomass emissions from biomass combustion from residential, commercial, industrial, and electricity generation. And so on that final chart, it's the last chart in the whole report actually, you'll see the different scenarios with our kind of annual gross emissions, the ones we've been talking about. And then on top of those are light orange. On top of those, there's a darker orange bar, and the biomass emissions. And then kind of subtracted from those is if you included sequestration. The idea being that if you include sequestration, you should include the biomass emissions. And so the black line on that chart is kind of what our net emissions for the state would be.
Molly?
Yeah, I think this exists somewhere, but as we were trying in the transportation committee, trying to figure out what to do about incentives for electric vehicles, is there a way to quantify if you change out so many, internal combustion engine vehicles with electric vehicles, what does that do to the emissions? Is there a way to quantify that? That would be helpful
Yes.
for us.
There certainly is. In terms of doing it in this inventory, that would be incorporated for the national emissions inventory years. So for 2017, that's going to be incorporated in all of the kind of inputs that I prepare for this very robust emissions model that EPA runs for us. And so I give them kind of a breakdown of different vehicle, passenger cars, passenger trucks, and different fuel types. So percentage diesel for each of those, percent gasoline, percent zero emission vehicles. And so that would be how that would be subtracted out of the whole emissions profile.
This would be in this national emissions inventory report?
It would be. You wouldn't know it was in there unless you really dug into the methodology of it all. But yes, that would be they would not include emissions from those zero emissions vehicles in that total. And so, sorry, I probably didn't answer your question quite well enough. For the other years,
I just want the numbers.
the actual number,
You know, how we can find out, okay, if we do this much, these many incentives, it's gonna create, you know, this many electric vehicles, and that's gonna result in X number of, you know, emissions reduction.
absolutely. Yeah, you certainly could figure that out. I don't know that off the top of my head. You'd have to make assumptions on the vehicles that were being replaced and the amount of fuel that they used every year, but those are kind of.
Somebody might be able to figure it out.
For sure, those are pretty standard assumptions. You just have to, put them together and come up with your total.
Collin, how do you, I guess my question is, where does the edge of the data set end? Does it end at the border of Vermont? Or I'm particularly thinking of HQ. You know, we're in 1990 we had Yankee, we considered that zero emission. We don't have Yankee anymore. We kind of have a methodology that considers Hydro-Quebec zero emission, which is not accurate, but it's not creating emissions in Vermont. So does the model deal with that?
So for every sector besides electricity, the borders are Vermont. For the electricity sector, a lot of states use generation-based estimates, so it's exclusively the electricity generated within that state, the emissions associated with that. We decided that wasn't really an accurate portrayal of our emissions that we were responsible for, because our in-state generation is a very small fraction of our total usage. So the way that we calculate that is from the Public Service Department, we get data on the kilowatt hours that all the electric utilities purchase by generation type. And so tell you how many kilowatt hours of Hydro-Quebec or other hydro or wind or solar or natural gas or the whole multitude. And then we just apply an emissions factor that we get from ISO New England, kind of the regional grid manager, if you will, to that to come up with our emissions. And so we do include generation from outside the state, certainly. To your Hydro-Quebec point, I would definitely agree that there should probably be some emissions associated with that. I think quantifying them is very problematic.
So we just ignore that.
Yes. From what I've read, it really, a lot of the emissions associated are, one, just very complicated to quantify and depend on the amount of organic matter in the reservoir, and depends on your latitude. It's much worse in the tropics than it is farther north. And so I think putting together anything that we would actually include in the inventory would make it a real rough estimate.
So following up on that, all of our targets hinge to 1990 levels, but we're going to get better at all of these measurements. And do you see that? I mean, are we going to reach a point where we just say, all right, it's not about 1990 anymore because what we measured then was so primitive compared to what we have now, but we're just going to hit it's got to be X tons of reduction? Or do you see my question?
I do. That's a very interesting question. So right now, how we do it is we update all the way back to 1990. So our 1990 baseline changes.
Okay.
Yeah, and so it makes incorporating new data sets kind of problematic sometimes, because if you don't have data back to 1990, you either can't use it or you have to try to somehow backcast it accurately to get there. Otherwise, as you say, it's going to skew your percent difference. So I think that's not going to be my call. I think that'll be a real an important discussion if we do end up getting more robust data sets to analyze, because I'm assuming a lot of them will not go back that far. It'll be very hard to project back that far. I'm not sure how to answer it, but it's definitely a big question.
So we have several other items on our agenda, and thank you for your time. Which committees have you presented this data to so that we can direct people to look at the committee page if they want to dig into your report?
Sure, just House Energy and Technology at this point.
Okay. So anyone in the room, if you want to dig into Collin's report and come up with a dozen other questions to ask him sometime when we catch him in the hall, House Energy and Technology Committee page will have that, probably under your name or under Peter Walk.
My name, Judy.
Great. Thank you very much. Mike, you want to hit that TV? Thank you. Do we want to jump to RES?
Sure. So this is RES is the Renewable Energy Standards Bill that Perchlik and I worked on and others co-sponsored. It's S.220 An. It will be up for discussion on Tuesday in Senate Finance Week. In the Senate, the Natural Resources and Energy Committee and the Senate Finance sort of share jurisdiction on these issues. So it's taken us a little time to figure out where that lands. It's now in Senate Finance. It's up for discussion on Tuesday to begin, and the chair seems to be quite intent on moving it. It's wonderful. It does 4 basic things, and some of that is very relevant to what we just discussed. It pushes our utilities that currently have a 75% renewable target in 2032 to reach 100% renewable by 2030. So pushing them further, faster. There, by the way, seem to be so far on board with that. It doubles the amount of in-state renewable production, which still sticks to the 2032 target, but instead of demanding 10% in-state production, it doubles that to 20% production. And I'm looking at Mike and Auburn because this came out of your subcommittee of our working group. The third thing it does is it asks that we limit the amount of power that comes from Hydro-Quebec to 33% of a utility's load. Because when we move from 75 to 100%, if the utilities just go gobble all of that from HQ, I'm not sure we're ahead of the game at all. There is increasing evidence, even if, as Collin says, it's hard to quantify, that when you flood new areas, you're releasing a lot of methane, and that is several factors worse than carbon. And HQ is the biggest hydro producer in the world, and they actually want to grow. So we need to make sure, I think, if we're being honest about emissions, that we do not add pressure to have them grow. So the bill attempts to limit it at 33% with the carve out. I think the Vermont Electric Co-op is already well over 50% of their power coming from HQ. So what we said in that case is, if you're over 33%, we're going to limit you to what you had in 2019. That will be controversial. That discussion will be controversial. I know the Sierra Club is going to come in and has talked about anyway, saying it shouldn't be pegged to a percentage because we're going to grow our demand on electricity. It should be pegged to kilowatt hour. I welcome them to come have that discussion. The fourth piece of that bill is, and let me just say, we have no limit anywhere in law or in our energy plan, as far as I know, of how much power we can take from HQ. So this is an important point to start having a discussion on. The fourth thing it does is it charges the Public Service Board, Public Service Department to help us think through storage. Renewable energy producers, solar installers, REV, they all want a mandate to install batteries. Green Mountain Power is already installing batteries. You know, so are there hurdles? We're just trying to dig in a little bit. We want to keep that discussion going, but we weren't quite ready to mandate storage when the market seems to be doing it a little bit themselves. So anyway, that's the renewable energy bill. It's talked about in the Times Argus editorial and in the 30-some environmental groups that have come together as part of their platform. It's talked about as a 100% renewable bill. That's great shorthand for a number of reasons, not the least of which is everybody likes that idea. So, anyway, that's S.220, and that discussion is underway in earnest on Tuesday, and that was one of our banner bills. And thank you, Senator MacDonald is signed on. I'm sure Senator McCormick would have, but we filed it too quickly. And we do have a majority of the Senate Finance Committee sponsored the bill, also majority of the Senate Natural Resources Committee, and Senator Ash. So we've got some muscle behind it, I hope, and hope that can move forward. What else?
Excellent. So two banner priorities that we've talked about today. Good to get updates. Thank you to the Senate for launching those two ideas, those two bills very well. Now we need to shift gears and hear back from folks who are shepherding the Every Committee project.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of time.
So we don't have a lot of time. If you have some updates for us on your Every Committee project, Emily Kornheiser couldn't be here today, but she said that her climate and workforce stuff is going to be taken up in House of Congress in a couple of weeks. So she's obviously talked to her chair, has got some ideas in play. Anyone else have a good update?
I would like to check back with John Erickson about the genuine progress indicator and see how we actually could help make it a more robust tool that would be useful. And he did put together a budget. You know, if we want him to come in and talk to the caucus about how this can be used in the appropriations process, I think he'd be available for that.
Okay. Great. Mark?
Let me be short. The member of the Transportation Committee is here. There was a question earlier about how much transportation deals with fuel consumption, and I brought slides today. Just one. My slide, 92% of the carbon from transportation is in trucks and light cars. The little thing you can't see here, the little slice, that's electric vehicles. Last night, Senator Pearson, myself, and Chair Briglin went to a meeting dealing with these issues. We heard the person that was directing Massachusetts the copy of the bill that we signed together, Senator Pearson, and seeing what they did in Massachusetts. So we're going to share with you at a future date the proposals that we're working on for vehicles and how to reduce carbon. We picked transportation because it's the area where we're using more than we used to. Our proposal is going to focus on the 92%, the vehicles that use internal combustion engines. And we picked that area in our proposal because that's where the target is. And because of my second slide, if I had it, would be the book, Designing Climate Solutions, which is a rather boring book because it gives you proposals that have already been done. So we will bring that in. And there are several reasons, several things that you folks need to weigh in on once we present it to you, which is how do you keep from disadvantaging the rural folks any more than they are now? How do you not disadvantage the poor any more than they are now? How do you deal with the person who needs a pickup truck to drive to work as an independent contractor? And the proposal will provide solutions to that, and we seek your input on that. So that's a coming attraction, that's a trailer, and that's all the time that I wanted to take today.
So folks, we are going to do a continued check-in on Every Committee bills next week. And also, if you can please give some thought to giving feedback on our principles that we talked about last week. Emily Kornheiser can get you the document if you don't have it.
I sent it out to at the beginning of the week. So
We're gonna try to wrap that up next week on the principal.
And next week we have a caucus photograph, hopefully outside on the front steps at noon, because we don't get this room until 12:15 next week. So if you want to be in the photograph, spread the word, bring your fellow Planet Caucus members and be outside at 12.
Sure, so something to track.